Survival Nation has been on my radar for a minute with some seriously high reviews on both Steam and the MetaQuest store, but after trying it out I can't help but wonder if some of that love is more about the dev team than about the game itself. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely something exciting about jumping into a VR zombie apocalypse, but when you start digging deeper, there are a few things that don't quite add up. For one, there's a surprisingly low achievement rate for tasks that should be pretty easy, like getting 1,000 gold or just using the in-game chat. This game is cross-platform too, so these achievements should be universal, which leaves us with the question of why aren't more players actually playing the game long enough to hit these early milestones? Let's find that answer together with a deep dive review of Survival Nation, starting with the mechanics. When it comes to Survival Nation's mechanics, there's potential, but it's clear that some areas need more polish to truly shine. The combat system, for example, feels a bit uneven. Surprisingly, I found that using a club to take down zombies was far easier than unaliving them with a gun, which is unexpected for a zombie survival game. It's not that the combat doesn't work, but it feels like melee weapons, at least in the early game, are favored over firearms in terms of effectiveness, which is a bit of a head scratcher for me. One of the more awkward aspects of the game, though, is how it handles item management. In a fast-paced survival environment, you need quick and intuitive controls. Unfortunately, switching between weapons like holstering your gun to pull out a club requires navigating a menu instead of simply holstering your weapon to pull out a club. To be fair, I wasn't using the default controls. I switched to manual weapon holstering and reloading controls, which for some reason in this game is in beta. Now, for a platform where immersion is key, this kind of system feels more at home in a traditional console experience rather than VR. It's weird because streamlining this so you can interact more naturally with your environment would make a big difference and allow players to stay more engaged in the moment. I just feel this was simply a big missed opportunity. The leveling system isn't bad though, if not a little unclear. I leveled up to 5 without even noticing since there weren't any obvious chimes or level up noises. That said, the ability to spend skill points and customize your character's abilities by unlocking new and useful survival skills falls well within the expectations for a survival game. And speaking of expectations, at its core, Survival Nation is a zombie survival title. This means you'll be juggling the usual elements of staying alive in relatively unforgiving environments. And like most games in this genre, you'll need to manage resources such as hunger and thirst to keep your character in fighting shape. These survival elements do, in fact, complement the game's overall theme. You start the game as a new member of a camp, which means you're thrown into a series of tutorial-like quests designed to teach you the basics, like crafting, resource management, and general survival tactics. On one hand, it's nice to have a hands-on tutorial where you're actively doing things instead of reading through long walls of text. It helps you get into the game faster, which is crucial for maintaining immersion in a VR environment. And while I'm sure we can all appreciate an interactive tutorial, the process still felt a bit tedious. Mainly because the whole go here, do this, come back blueprint is a questing style that we've all seen done 100 times before. When it works well, you don't notice, but without harping on it too much, you'll definitely notice it in Survival Nation. In between tutorial tasks, you're still reading quite a bit of text, and while it's not an absolutely devastating amount, it was enough to make me take my headset off and rub my eyes. It kind of defeats the purpose of having an immersive hands-on tutorial if you're going to throw walls of text in it anyway. But I digress. Moving on to the visuals, for a game set in a zombie apocalypse, you'll find the environments are functional and create the expected atmosphere for this kind of game, though the overall visual quality might not be as high as you'd expect. While the character models and environments do their job, they don't always have the level of detail that really pulls you into the world. Now, I don't know why, but that fleeting feeling of immersion is more noticeable here than I expected. While it's understandable that VR games are a bit harder to squeeze into standalone headsets than a traditional flat-screen game, I did notice some performance drops when running on the highest settings. For a game with this level of visuals, I was left wanting, especially in a game that demands smooth and immersive gameplay. What really stood out here were some of the smaller immersive details. For instance, the game's handling of collisions is surprisingly realistic compared to other VR games I've played. You can actually slip your fingers into the crevices of tables, which isn't as common as you might think for VR. And on the topic of nice, uncommon experiences, one of the standout features of Survival Nation is its voice acting. I was genuinely impressed with how natural and realistic the dialogue felt from the NPCs. Based on the VR games I've played, this is easily some of the closest AAA quality voice acting I've encountered in this space.
We have a lot of catching up to do, but first, you'll have to go through our Survival 101 for new camp members. I know, you probably know all this, but still, the rules are the rules.
The conversations, while one-sided, have a lifelike quality that adds a lot to the immersion, making the interactions with the world feel more engaging, which is a big pick-me-up for a game like this.
Get yourself some tomatoes. You'll definitely need them.
That said, there is one noticeable quirk with the audio transitions. The music switches from environmental to combat music, but the transitions can be noticeably delayed. There were times when I'd already finished off a zombie only for the combat music to kick in moments later. It feels a bit awkward and takes away a bit from the intensity of those encounters, especially when the combat music starts after the fight is already over. Despite the missteps with the music transitions though, the audio design in Survival Nation is one of its stronger features. The immersive voice acting helps bring the world to life, even if the music timings could use a little more fine-tuning. Speaking of fine-tuning, having a dialed-in experience in VR is important, especially when you take into account motion sickness, so let's briefly touch on the options available to you. One thing I immediately noticed in the options is that there's no vignette effect, which is commonly included in VR games to reduce motion sickness. It does so by creating a tunnel vision effect during movement. Given the nature of this game, it feels like a strange omission. If you get motion sick in VR, let me know in the comments if you prefer to play seated or standing without a vignette. I'm genuinely curious. Overall though, the settings menu itself is functional, though they could have definitely benefited from more customization options, especially considering this game's price point. Which brings us to the score breakdown for this game. As usual, if a game isn't in early access, it gets a scorecard comparing it to games released in the same year or around the same time. That said, mechanics gets a 2 out of 6. While the mechanics themselves aren't too terrible, they do feel cookie cutter and more like a VR port rather than an actual VR game. Theme gets a 3 out of 6 because this game does still have its identity as a zombie survival game, even if it does feel a little too generic. Graphics gets a 2 out of 6. While the zombies do look like zombies and the world isn't terrible to look at, the world itself doesn't look all that amazing and really should run smoother on higher settings. Audio gets a 5 out of 6 because the voice acting here is pretty awesome. If I'm being honest, it's probably the biggest draw of this game for me. And options gets a 2 out of 6 because, let's be real, natural VR features like physics holstering should be default and at the very least should not be in beta in 2024. With Survival Nation currently sitting at almost 200 mostly positive reviews on Steam and 4.1 out of 5 stars on the MetaQuest store, it's clear that many players are enjoying their experience. Though I have to admit, I'm surprised given the current lack of polish on these features. For a game priced at $30, I expected much more in terms of options and the overall experience. For those reasons, this game walks away with an overall immersion score of 2.5 out of 6. As it stands now, this game feels like it needed more quality assurance testing before release, but as usual, never trust any one source before purchasing a game. Do your homework and check out some of my other reviews if you're searching for your next VR purchase, but before you do, obligatory like and subscribe, and until next time, stay immersed.